Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We thank you for being with us on this rainy May morning. I was saying before, I'm sort of glad it's raining outside, so we wouldn't be tempted to go out on a nice May day. So, on behalf of the Pax Christi Metro DC-Baltimore Council, we want to welcome all of you to our spring assembly on gun violence prevention. And again, my name is Bob Cook, and I'm the co-chair of the council. My other co-chair, Josephine Garnham, sends her regrets for not being here. We inadvertently, the Pax Christi USA National Council also scheduled their weekend meeting for this weekend. So Josephine, and I know a lot of people know Charlene Howard, and there's a lot of other people who would have been here, but they can't. But a little bit later on, Bob Moore will be telling you a little bit about the Pax Christi USA gun violence prevention group and an upcoming event that they're going to have that Josie will be at also. So I'm sure gun violence prevention is an issue that has concerned a lot of us, at least those who are a little older, for quite a long time. In 1994, the federal legislation that was passed that year made it appear to me, and I'm sure others, that we were going in the right direction with gun violence prevention. But that law sunsetted in 2004, and at the same time, the NRA was getting more and more influence, and therefore we've probably been, in some ways, almost going backwards. And gun violence has only increased in our streets and in our schools and everywhere else. But as people of faith, we believe that we have a God of love. And hopefully more and more people will realize that. And they'll put their trust more in the Sixth Commandment, thou shalt not kill, rather than the Second Amendment, where too many of our fellow citizens seem to put their faith right now. So we hope this morning will provide us with some new insights, and for those of us who need it, to renew our will to work towards having a less violent and more peaceful society. So again, I just want to thank you on behalf of the council for being with us. And I just want to turn it over now to Luann Mostel, who's going to lead us in an opening prayer. Luann?
Thank you, Bob. As we start our conference, let us focus on our goal of gun violence prevention. In a land where there are 120 guns for every 100 people, I think this prayer, composed by the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, which is based in this Metro DC area, Silver Spring, addresses this need. I will be reading the prayer, and all can follow the text, or you can just focus, close your eyes, and think about the words. Let the shooting end. Oh God, our hearts are broken with pain at the senseless deaths caused by gun violence. Families mourn. Children live in fear. And some in our nation respond by arming themselves with more guns, with greater capacity to end life. Our disconnection and alienation have caused some to turn to guns for protection and safety. We ask that you touch our hearts with your love, heal our brokenness, and turn us away from violence and towards peace. Help us to transform our own hearts and seek peaceful ways of resolving our differences. Let our hands reach out and connect with those who feel alone, those who live in fear, and those suffering from mental illness. Let our voices be raised, asking our legislatures to enact gun laws to protect all in our society, especially those most vulnerable. Let our pens write messages demanding change, while also scripting words of hope and transformation. We ask this in the name of the God who desires that we live together in peace. Amen.
Thank you, Luann. Thank you for centering us to begin our time together today. I want to quickly try to go over our agenda for today's assembly. We're going to start by hearing from Reverend Graylan Hagler. Reverend Hagler was raised in Baltimore, and he's a UCC minister who has ministered in inner city congregations in Chicago, Boston, and for a number of decades here in DC at Plymouth Congregational United Church for Christ, before recently retiring. His church, as many of you may know, is located, the church he formerly pastored is located on North Capitol Street, just a mile or so from Archbishop Carroll High School, where we had hoped to have this assembly originally. And we know that Reverend Hagler will move our spirits to start off the assembly. And so after hearing from Reverend Hagler this morning, we originally planned to have 2 workshop sessions and 2 workshops in each session for a total of 4 different workshops. However, due to a multitude of reasons, including some of our college students being distracted by final exams, and in some cases organizing for the people of Gaza on their college campuses, we decided to just go with one youth workshop. So everyone, after we hear from Reverend Hagler, everybody will get a chance to choose 1 of 2 workshops. And then after that, we're going to reconvene, and we're going to have all together, we're going to then have the most informative session of our assembly today. We're going to hear about the current legal status on gun violence prevention legislation, some of the stuff that has just passed in local and state and federal jurisdictions. And we're going to hear about 3 different cases that are before the Supreme Court right now, and that will be decided pretty soon. So we should get a lot of really good information, updated information from that part. So we know some of our participants here today, unfortunately, have felt the scourge of gun violence more personally than others, by having family or friends having been victimized by gun violence. So if this is the case for you, we encourage you to do the following. If you are comfortable, and if you're, please share any of these feelings or thoughts you have with us during the assembly in whatever ways you can. If you don't want to share them out loud, if you happen to know somebody who's on the Zoom today, you may just want to send them a chat and let them know how you're feeling. If things are, getting too emotional for you, we please ask you to just take a break from the assembly. And if you are a student, we also ask you to reach out to a counselor or another teacher at your school when you return to school, and ask for some help in trying to work out some of these painful emotions that we all would have from having experienced somebody we know and love being injured or killed due to gun violence. And finally, if you're not a student and you're still having some trauma from knowing somebody that was injured or killed because of gun violence, please reach out to us and we'll try to help you get some counseling if you need. Okay, so we are going now to start our assembly presentation by hearing from Reverend Hagler. I just want to make one quick technical note and then just a further introduction of Reverend Hagler before we start. So when Reverend Hagler is speaking, please try to put down any questions that you may have in the chat, in the Zoom chat. And one of our Bob Moores, we have two Bob Moores with us here today, will be reviewing some of those questions, and he'll be then at the end of Reverend Hagler's talk, Bob will be asking Reverend Hagler to respond to as many of the questions that you put in the chat as possible. So please do that while Reverend Hagler is speaking. So as I mentioned, Graylan is retired from Plymouth Congregational Church, but he's retired as being pastor, but he's still very, very active in many different things. One of the things he's does now is a senior advisor to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and or also known as FOR. And I think most of us, a lot of us, at least some of us who have been around the peace movement for a while, know that Fellowship of Reconciliation is the oldest ongoing faith-based peace movement in the United States. FOR International and FOR USA started at the time of World War I, so it's well over 100 years. And again, Reverend Hagler is a senior advisor for FOR. And after his talk and the questions and answers, he'll be sharing a little bit with you too about a related conference that FOR is going to have in Atlanta in October that is going to be on both gun violence and white nationalism. Many of us have been very privileged to have Reverend Hagler inspire us at many of the Gaza vigils that have been going on over the last 6 months. I myself have been privileged to go down to his church 3 or 4 times during the last 10 years when Reverend Hagler was inviting peacemakers from both Israel and from Palestine to come and to talk to his congregation and talk to anybody else who would come. Because as a lot of us know, if we just rely on, U.S. television and newspapers, we're not going to hear the real truth about what's been going on in Gaza since 1948. So that was one of the many things Reverend Hagler has been doing for many years to try to bring those peacemakers here so we could all be educated a little bit more. So with that, I just want to turn it over to Reverend Hagler. Graylan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to be here with everyone. And as was mentioned, we've met numbers of times in demonstrations and rallies to talk about peace in the Middle East and to talk about Gaza. So I really appreciate this continued witness. And we're continuing with that witness this morning. Your theme is stop in the name of God. And I add the words race, guns, and country. As we know in America, there is a fixation that we have about guns, about firearms. It has often been portrayed as the tool that will protect us from the bad guys. A gun in the hand of a good guy, the NRA want us to think, is the equalizer to all of the bad guys out there with evil intentions. We have glorified the rugged Wild West with claims that it was tamed through the righteous use of a gun. The cowboy in the white hat protected women and children from the thirstiness, the bloodthirstiness of savage natives, and protected the public from those who were lawless and evil. When I think about my childhood, my growing up, my movie experiences, guns go hand in hand with the John Waynes, Randolph Scotts, and Clint Eastwood. Guns somehow, in the American ethos, represents our salvation from lawlessness, savagery, robbery, rape, and pillage. In the American psychic, guns seem to hold this very revered place. As we all know, guns and the right to own it is protected and codified in the Second Amendment. Second Amendment guarantees a well-regulated militia as being necessary to keep the security of the state. It demands that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These words are interpreted as a sacred right to own and possess a firearm, that the state cannot confiscate it under any circumstance. The debate is whether the government has the right to regulate in any shape, form, or fashion the ownership of guns and or the paraphernalia of guns. The courts have favored gun ownership and excused any attempt to regulate it. In Washington, D.C., where there were strict gun laws in place, the court struck down those laws, ruling that any restriction on guns and even regulations around how those weapons were to be stored in homes was a violation of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. Legislative bodies have been reticent in limiting assault weapons or high-capacity magazines. So we got to ask the question, where did the Second Amendment come from? Why so sacrosanct? And what was the incentive for its creation? To answer that question, we got to explore some history surrounding the development of the Second Amendment and the rationale for its creation. The Second Amendment, I want to submit, is a testimony to the country's racist history and to the protection of whiteness. Second Amendment was ratified 1791. and codified the right for white citizens to bear arms in order to protect themselves. Now, this is not a misreading of the genesis of the Second Amendment. And this statement is confirmed when we look at and understand the development of this amendment, the reasons for it, and the discussions that created it. In Philadelphia, at the Constitution Convention, 1787, James Madison and a group of 54 delegates came together to unite a federation of diverse states, which was on the brink of collapse because of tensions surrounding the creation of a constitution. Madison recognized that though all the delegates were determined to create a viable union, there were at least two, divergent agendas afoot. The Deep South was intent on strengthening the slaveholders' power and protecting the institution of slavery. Meanwhile, other delegates who were not as dependent on agrarian enterprise were motivated by a variety of other reasons. These divergent point of views made the dreams of forming a United States held hostage by the aims, goals, and the fears of the enslavers. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, for example, blasted the Atlantic slave trade as cruel and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity. John Rutledge of South Carolina retorted, warning that any attempt to curtail the slave trade will ensure that North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia would never agree to a constitution unless their right to import slaves was untouched. The threat of non-ratification secured for the South 20 additional years for the Atlantic slave trade, brought into being the 3/5 of a human being clause in the Constitution, and created the fugitive slave clause. When it came time to debate federal control of state militias, the proposed language gave to Congress the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for the deployment of the various state militias to deal with invasions and insurrections. When this draft was introduced, it again created a schism among the delegates. The strongest objections came from the anti-federalists in both the North and the South. They rejected the idea of a stronger central government. And what I want to add, don't you hear that today? They rejected this idea of a strong central government. They argued against congressional control of the militia, believing that it was a pathway to a standing army, tyranny, and the destruction of their rights. Madison tried to allay the fears of the South and offered that the militia clause would give to the states supplementary security by allowing Congress to enlist the help of other states in suppressing insurrections. Here in the language, insurrection meaning slave uprisings. Madison's assurance did not allay the fears of slaveholders. For them, state militias had a very specific purpose. They were key to crushing revolts by enslaved people and buttressing enforcement of the slave codes, laws that maintained the racial hierarchy by banning black access to firearms, outlawing literacy, and forbidding unfettered movement. Southerners worried that by placing militias in the hands of Congress was risky business because the federal government could decide not to fund or harm the state militias. In this situation, it was argued white people would be defenseless against those they enslaved. Due to those regional differences, by early 1788, the ratification process was grinding to a halt. George Washington sent Madison to Richmond to use his powers to bring Virginia back into the fold and to jumpstart the ratification process. Patrick Henry and George Mason stood in the way of ratification. They were concerned that control of a militia in the hands of a federal government that was dominated by northern states, such as Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, which had already begun to end slavery in those states, was a dangerous proposition for the institution of slavery. Henry and Mason asserted that the central government could not be trusted to hold authority over the militias. The question they felt that needed to be answered was, what would keep a Congress dominated by Northerners from refusing to defend the state from a slave rebellion? Mason argued that enslavers would be left defenseless. Patrick Henry argued, they'll take your niggas from you. Finally, Virginia narrowly ratified the Constitution, but only with an agreement that ensured in amendment language a well-regulated militia. 3 of the 13 colonies, however, had yet to ratify the Constitution. And even those in Virginia made it clear that they had ratified it with deep reservations. Momentum was building to start all over again. Henry and his allies called for a Bill of Rights to rein in the powers of the federal government and to give more power to the states. Specifically, they wanted language about the militia to limit how long state forces would be under national control and to place strict rules on how Congress would use those state militias. In other words, they were paranoid and did not want to feel defenseless. Madison felt a need to quell the discontentment expressed by Henry by crafting a Bill of Rights in an attempt to mollify the anti-federalists and enslavers and still have a national government's power in place. Patrick Henry had made it clear that he could not abide with the idea where the federal government would control the militia. The Bill of Rights, therefore, focused on the limitation of federal powers in order to quiet the dissent against ratification. The Second Amendment declared, as you know, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and that short-circuited Masons, Henrys, and the other Southerners' worries. They were worried that a federal government would and could, one way or another, render the militia impotent as a slave control device. As a Virginian, Madison knew that the militia's prime function in his state and throughout the South was slave control. Now I gave you that history to demonstrate how the use of violence, guns, militia, military, was established for the purposes of oppression and subjugation. The Second Amendment grew and was born of this history. It was a device to ensure the protection and security of the white slaveholding population. And even after that, after the demise of slavery, that so-called right was never intentionally extended to the non-white population. Because all you need to do is go through a history of court cases to realize those who were not white, who used a weapon in self-defense, were convicted of murder anyway. The use of weapons, guns, and violence is a tool to protect the wealthy and power elite and to subjugate, exploit, and oppress masses of people. This bias is built into the Bill of Rights. Even today, the First Amendment that we're hearing a lot about is a tool of whites and for whites. And those who are not white are penalized, maligned, and marginalized for the use of freedom of speech. Look at the groups that have been banned from many colleges and universities because of their support of Palestine. In fact, the Congress just passed a bill that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. My premise is that the Bill of Rights was not designed to be a protection for all the people, but a protection for some. The Second Amendment gave the right to possess and use a tool that safeguarded the god of wealth, exploitation, and colonialism. The use of a gun, the prevalence of firearms, has made possible some of the most vile and dehumanizing episodes in this country and in world history. This worship of the gun and the macho-ness embodied in it has been used to enforce the institution of slavery, remove and exterminate native populations, take land from other countries, such as Mexico, and to fight wars of annexation and colonialization. Ideals of manifest destiny were implemented through the barrel of a gun, along with a well-equipped military that conquered and subdued people worldwide. Throughout the world, in the Caribbean, South and Central America, the colonialization of Africa, the submission of peoples, the making of marketplaces, the creation of colonies, and the stealing of the world resources have all been because of this tool called the gun and its more deadly and destructive manifestations. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in Vietnam, he said at least a couple of things to remember, and I'm going to paraphrase, that this country is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. The other point that he was making, that how could he continue to speak, and how can we continue to speak about nonviolence at home when we practice violence all over the world and at home. It is contradictory to speak of nonviolence and continue to be a violent nation. You ever notice how we love to speak to the whole world about nonviolence as long as it fits within our paradigm of obedience? We tell every country how to act as long as it fits within our system of control. Democracy is something that is also concocted. We don't have democracy at home, and we don't force democracy abroad. We focus obedience abroad. Democracy at home is a farce. More than 56% of the people in the U.S. are currently against the war in Gaza. Only 36% support the war, and yet the government presses on in its support of the war, its latest installment of weapons, and its support of genocide taking place in Gaza. It is a farce. As King pointed out, not in these words, but I will paraphrase, that the U.S. is the biggest exporter of weapons in the world. This exportation of weapons is so that our so-called allies can fight proxy wars on our behalf, destabilize regions, and protect U.S. interests. Now, nobody ever adds the word U.S. economic interests, but that's what they're talking about. Economic interests, controlling the marketplace, which means generally taking what you want. You know that Psalm, the 23rd Psalm, that says, "The Lord is my shepherd. I see what I want." That has been the expression of the U.S. The U.S. is the world's largest arms supplier. U.S. military exports rose by 17% between 2014 to 18, and again between 2019 and 23. Interestingly enough, ours rose by 17%, and Russia fell by 53%. France's arms exports grew by 47%, and it moved ahead of Russia to become the second largest purveyor of weapons in the world. The United States is Israel's biggest supplier of military hardware, accounting for 69% of its total arsenal and growing between 2019 and 2023. The use of the gun, of assault weapons, is a fixture in American life, and it causes death and destruction all around the world. There have been more in this country. There have been more than 656 mass shootings in 2023. There's an average of 118 deaths per day by gun violence in this nation. The U.S. ratio of guns per household is 120.5 per 100 homes. This surpasses that of any other nation in the world. Gun ownership grew significantly over the last few years, showing a drastic increase at the election of President Barack Obama. Ask yourself the question, why is that the case? Recent studies show that 7.5 million U.S. adults became new gun owners between 2019 and 2021. The world, in a nutshell, is in a mess. And the U.S. is in a mess. And the U.S. is one of the largest architects of that mess. And we got to ask the question, what can we do? What can we do to begin to turn the tide? Recently, not too long ago, a couple years ago, after brazen killings in Ward 4 of DC, we stood at a press conference with our council member who wept and cried about the rash of killings that had gone on in Ward 5. And I whispered to my colleague, Reverend Patricia Fears of Fellowship Baptist Church, that the clergy needed to do something that was out of the ordinary. And that was that we needed to hold at least a 72-hour, around-the-clock prayer vigil. We did that. We were awake all night, moved from church to church, 72 hours. The street corners, 72 hours. We kept the prayers going without any time off, without any gap. Interestingly enough, and miraculously, there were no homicides in Ward 4 that took place during that prayer vigil. We were all surprised when the media announced that there was not one killing and not one gun fired in those 72 hours of vigil. Since then, Ward 4 clergy have continued to meet and have continued to hold vigils, continued to go out in the corners and stand at the schools and stand and to be present and public in their prayer life. What we can do is continue to carry out actions, public witnesses, and demonstrate, to educate the public, to challenge the public about wars at home, in in terms of gun violence, wars abroad, and the atrocities abroad. Now remember this, that white supremacy is the undergirding ideology for violence around the globe and at home. Now, you may say that sounds crazy, but remember, as native populations were being pushed off their land, the one thing that became prevalent in native indigenous peoples' communities were guns and liquor. Guns and liquor to become addicted and to shoot one another. Stand your ground laws have allowed armed citizens to take the law into their own hands without training and accountability of public law, accountability to public law enforcement officials, with disproportionately harmful results for people of color. Stand your ground laws. No non-white person has been successful in using that law. I also have to continue to congratulate actions that have gone on at the Pentagon by Catholic groups and organizations and witnesses on military bases against armaments being manufactured and shipped out and around the world. We are called to speak and do justice as people of faith. We are called to be radical in our calls for peace and justice. But we must understand that peace and nonviolence cannot exist without justice. Even in communities like DC and Chicago, where we hear about shootings and killings just about every day, what goes hand in hand? Poverty and despair, the prevalence of firearms, and no way out of your condition. In other words, if we want to address creating a peaceful society, we have to address the amelioration of the conditions that people live in. So it is important that we work towards justice, that we continue to work to heal the nation, that we teach the nation about its violent ways, and that we understand that we are neighbors to one another. That doesn't mean just around the street or next door, but it means in the next country, the next continent as well. We are all sisters and brothers of each other, and we will learn eventually to live together in a spirit of equity and justice, or we will surely perish from this earth as a people. God bless you and continue your struggle.
Thank you so much, Reverend Hagler, for your really powerful and moving words. I'm embarrassed to say that personally, I'm very aware of militarism and racism going hand in hand internationally, but I'm embarrassed to say that I really hadn't thought anywhere as deeply as you explained to us again about the constitutional background of racism and the Second Amendment. So I thank you for that very much, and we will definitely try to I will definitely try to make sure your words get spread out to more white people like myself. It'd be nice if the Federal Society and some of the other constitutional history people would take yours, but I can pretty much guarantee that'll never happen. They'll never have your words. But anyway, thank you again so much. It's we maybe have time for one question or so, and I'm going to ask Bob more. I'm sure people, because I don't see too much of anything in the, there's only a few things in the chat now, but continue to put things in the chat, and maybe at the plenary, the end of the session today, we could address some more. So Bob Moore, do you have Bob 10 more? Did you have a question you would like to ask, or does Bob 00 more have anything you would like to ask Reverend Hagler?
Okay, I'll start just reading some of the questions that we had. What did the authors of the Second Amendment mean by well-regulated militia? And then who would regulate it and how would they regulate it?
It's a very good question. They meant that basically the states were to have control over a force that they could call out instantly. That there would be people that would be under the authority of the state. And initially, it was meant as men and men, not towards the British, but towards uprisings that would take place in the South, such as in Southampton County, Charleston, other places like that, where militias were called out.
Okay, there was another good question about, can a president order without agreement by the Congress or state governments, the state militia to imprison and deport immigrants?
Repeat that again, please.
Okay, can a president order without agreement by Congress or state governments, the state militia to imprison and deport immigrants?
I don't know the answer to that one, but that's an interesting one.
Okay.
The court will probably answer that.
There's in a way, a related one about what is the responsibility of gun manufacturers for their role in supplying guns to drug cartels and illegal to the coyotes who are doing such harm to people coming to this country?
Well, if I recollect, when we attempted, and when I say we, I'm talking collectively, to sue gun manufacturers for the harm that was done to residents of this country, to people of this country. If I recollect, it was ruled that that was an undue infringement on business. I think that's where we are.
Okay. I think we're running out of time. So why doesn't everybody keep on putting questions into the chat, and we will address them when we have time later on? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, that sounds great, Bob. Thank you. And so, Reverend Hagler, for your last thing, if we could, and Kurt, if you could pull up the link to the FOR website for the summit, and if Graylan, if you could just say a couple of words about the summit that will be happening in Atlanta.
Yeah, we're having this conference in Atlanta that we're building towards, and the dates are actually October 4th to the 6th, and it's really looking at forging peace in a violent world, how we deal with the issue of guns, and particularly Christian nationalism, which go hand in hand. God, guns, and Christian nationalism. We see the continued influence of Christian nationalism on our body politic, the way God is interpreted in the centrality of guns. So we're going to try to unpack that as a conference and deal with organizing into movements in local jurisdictions, how to basically bring some pressure onto the situation. So please join us if you can in Atlanta. And if you'd like to come, let me know. If you can't afford it, we'll figure out a way to get you to Atlanta to participate. Also, I put out a newsletter weekly right now around Palestine and Gaza. And if you want to sign up for that, you can. You can find that on my Facebook page, Graylan Hagler, and basically join through a link that you'll find there on that. There's an article on Christian nationalism I just wrote, which is the thing that hits me. It's interesting that as people rail against Christian nationalism, there are very few voices to condemn nationalism in general. It's not just Christian nationalism, but it's all forms of nationalism, and particularly religious nationalism that is xenophobic and always racist in character. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that what they keep talking about as Christian is not my form of Christianity. So how dare you try to apply that to me? I have to resist it. And I think that for all of us who are interested in justice and liberation, we can't have anybody else defining our relationship and understanding of the gospel.
Thank you, Graylan. Thank you very much. So just Bob Moore, could you just share a little bit about the Pax Christi USA gun violence group?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So Pax Christi USA last year started a gun violence prevention working group. And hang on one second here. Yeah, on May 18th, so 2 weeks from today, they're going to have a webinar from 1 to 3 p.m. entitled Beating Guns into Plowshares, a challenging conversation with Shane Claiborne. As some of you may know, Shane is a nationally known speaker, author, and activist. You can register for the webinar at the Pax Christi USA homepage. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a link to it on the right, and I'll also put a link in the chat. So please consider joining Pax Christi USA Gun Violence Prevention Working Group on May 18th for that conversation. At this point in our program, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll go into our workshops. So when you receive the Zoom link, you received instructions on how to access the breakout rooms where the workshops will occur. And I'll post those instructions again on the shared screen here. And so we're running slightly late, but let's come back at 10:10 to join our workshops. We'll see you then.
Good.